Hello everyone and welcome to Sherlock Tales. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Let us now dim the lights, settle in, and return once again to the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, where the brilliant Sherlock Holmes faces one of the most chilling and perplexing cases of his career. This is the Clockmaker of Ashcroft Abbey. It was during the tail end of that particularly bitter winter in 1895 that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves once again without a case and with nothing to occupy the long hours but the ever-growing silence of Baker Street and Holmes's violin, which that month favoured slow, dissonant Hungarian funeral airs. The fire was burning low, the coal supply short, and the mood even shorter when quite suddenly the post arrived, containing a single envelope which bore no stamp, no seal, and, curiously, no ink upon the paper. Holmes, seated cross-legged in his armchair, peered at the blank sheet with the intensity of a man reading the final page of scripture. "There is writing here," he murmured at last, holding it to the lamp. "Invisible to the eye, but not to heat." He stood and pressed it gently to the glass of the fireplace, and there, like ghostly ink bleeding through time, a message revealed itself line by line. "You are being watched. Do not speak. Come alone to the House of Clocks. Midnight. Ashcroft Abbey." B. Holmes turned to me, eyebrows arched. "My dear Watson, it would appear that discretion has once again summoned us into her chilly embrace." "Do you know this Ashcroft Abbey?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. Holmes nodded. "A crumbling estate turned mechanical asylum in Yorkshire, formerly home to one Reginald Ashcroft, madman, inventor, and clockmaker to Queen Victoria herself." "Mechanical asylum?" He smiled faintly. "You'll see." We departed Baker Street on the 7:35 northbound express under cover of fog, and did not speak more than a dozen words the entire journey. Holmes was in one of those moods I'd come to dread and admire, his eyes dark, his mind afire, his silence deafening. He had brought no books, no tobacco, not even his cherished syringe, only the blank letter, now folded precisely into quarters and tucked into the inner pocket of his coat. As we crossed into the moors of Yorkshire, the very air changed, thicker, damper, charged with something old and unsettled. The cab met us at the station in Harrogate, driven by a mute man with glassy eyes and a dog that growled when spoken to. The drive took over an hour, winding through forests twisted by wind and decades of rot, until finally the abbey emerged, its spires shattered, its bell tower a black tooth against the pale moon. Ashcroft Abbey, even in ruin, had an unnatural symmetry. Its walls leaned in at sharp, impossible angles, as though resisting collapse through sheer malevolence. At the top of the central stair, beneath an iron arch wound with ivy and rust, the front door stood open. Holmes did not knock. Inside, the abbey was colder than the moors. The floor tiles clicked with each step, echoing down hallways lined with long broken clock faces. A sound, faint but precise, echoed through the stone, a ticking, constant and unearthly, as if the very walls measured time in some ancient dialect. Then we saw him. A man stood at the end of the corridor, tall and wrapped in a velvet housecoat, one eye hidden by a brass monocle that clicked softly as he turned to face us. "You came," he said. "I was told you would." Holmes nodded once. "And you are?" "Bartholomew Ashcroft, nephew to the late Reginald. Welcome to the House of Clocks." He extended a hand, gloved in black leather. Holmes did not take it. We were led to what must have once been the chapel. The pews were gone, replaced with workbenches and gear-laden machinery. Enormous mechanical devices filled the space, some half clock, half organ, others ticking structures of such complexity they seemed to breathe. Bartholomew gestured to one. My uncle believed that time was not a measurement, but a message, that it could be written, transcribed. Holmes walked the perimeter in silence. 3 days ago, Bartholomew continued, my uncle's final invention, his life's work, was stolen. That same night, he was found dead. A heart attack? Holmes asked, not turning. Bartholomew's jaw tensed. They said as much, but his time of death did not match the wound. Holmes turned. Wound? Bartholomew reached into a drawer and produced a photograph, grainy but clear enough to see. A circular wound just above the heart, burned into the chest. Shaped like the dial of a clock. Back in our rooms, crumbling guest quarters just beneath the bell tower, Holmes sat in silence, the photograph spread out beside him. I had to ask, "What do you make of it?" He did not answer at first. Then, "That is not a wound, Watson. It is an imprint." "From the stolen device?" Holmes nodded. "A cipher built into a pocket watch. Reginald called it the palimpsest engine, a mechanical device that records truth and cannot be lied to." "Then why kill him?" Holmes looked up, and for the first time I saw something like fear in his eyes. "Because someone knew what he recorded." He leaned forward. "And they know we're here. I awoke in the grey hour just before dawn, not from any dream or disturbance, but from the unbearable silence. It was not merely the absence of noise, but the absence of something far more sinister, the cessation of that constant ticking which had permeated the Abbey from the moment we arrived. I rose quietly and crossed to Holmes's bed. It was empty. The wind outside moaned like an injured beast. Somewhere in the stone belly of Ashcroft Abbey, a door creaked open and then closed with a soft click. I lit a lantern, wrapped myself in my coat, and followed the sound down the corridor, past paintings hung too low and iron sconces with their candles burnt to stubs. The air carried the scent of oil, brass, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. I found Holmes standing in the chapel, staring at the central mechanism, an impossibly elaborate construction of gears, weights, and mirrors. He did not turn when I entered. "She's gone," he said. "Who?" "The clock," he replied. "Reginald's masterpiece, the palimpsest engine. The entire frame was concealed within that structure." "But I thought it had been stolen 3 days ago." Holmes's voice was as still as the air. "Bartholomew lied." As the morning broke, we convened again with Bartholomew in the eastern hall, a once grand dining room now littered with mechanical sketches and half-dissembled automata. Holmes's face was a mask of politeness as he examined the contents of a silver tray, a decanter of port, sliced apples, and a folded sheet of parchment. Bartholomew poured 2 glasses without being asked. "My apologies for the deception," he said, "but I had to be sure you were the real Holmes. I couldn't risk bringing in the police or the ministry." "The ministry is already here," Holmes replied. Bartholomew's hand froze mid-pour. "You've spoken to them?" "I've seen the shadow of their boots in the frost outside our window," Holmes said calmly, "and I recognize the scent of dead secrets when I smell them. Tell me, who else knew what your uncle built?" Bartholomew lowered the decanter. 4 men, all government, all members of a hidden council formed during the Boer War to develop listening devices. Your modern spycraft, one might say. Reginald's device was different. It remembered period. Holmes interlaced his fingers, so it wasn't just a recorder. Number it recorded intention. According to Reginald, it could interpret inflection, stress, deceit. I stared. A machine that could tell if someone was lying? More than that, Bartholomew said. It could reveal what they truly meant. We returned to the workshop just past noon. Holmes gestured for silence and led me to the back wall, where a curtain of thick velvet concealed something large. He pulled it aside. Behind it stood a mirror unlike any I'd ever seen, framed not in gold or wood but in overlapping gears. The surface shimmered faintly, as though caught between moments. "What is it?" I whispered. Holmes's voice was low. A viewing mirror. Reginald designed it to reflect not what is, but what was said in its presence. And then, to my astonishment, the mirror spoke. Not audibly, but through flickering shapes and fog-like impressions. I saw two figures, one tall and shaking, the other calm and cloaked. Their conversation was blurred, but one phrase rang out, clear and unmistakable. "They cannot know the Watcher is among them." Holmes stepped back. "The Watcher? Who is that?" He looked at me with narrowed eyes. Not who, what? Over the course of that day, Holmes pored over Reginald's journals, which Bartholomew reluctantly handed over. They were maddening to read, written in code, layered with diagrams, references to ancient timekeeping methods, and phrases like echo storage and cognitive tuning. One diagram stood out, a gear suspended in liquid wired into a typewriter. "It responds," Holmes said, "not to keystrokes, but to thoughts." We stared at the sketch in silence. "I don't believe this is a machine," Holmes continued. "It's a listener, a clockwork confessional. And someone has used it to hear something they should not have." He turned to Bartholomew. "Who did Reginald meet with in the final week of his life?" Bartholomew hesitated. Then, "He received a visitor." I never saw a face, only that he wore gloves and carried a walking cane shaped like an Ouroboros. Holmes nodded slowly. "Then he's here." That night, Holmes insisted we search Reginald's private quarters, sealed since the funeral. The room was cathedral-like in height and silent as a tomb. Everything inside was arranged as though the occupant had stepped out only minutes before. A pocket watch sat open on the desk, its hands spinning madly in reverse. Holmes examined it. "This is the twin," he said. "One half of the palimpsest engine." I moved toward the bed and then froze. There, beneath the pillow, was a wax-sealed envelope addressed to S. Holmes. Holmes broke the seal with care. The letter inside read, "If you are reading this, then I am already lost. They will come for the engine. They will claim it is for the crown. But it is not. It is for the truth. And the truth is a dangerous thing. Beware the one who speaks in time. R.A." I turned to Holmes, chilled. "What does it mean?" He folded the letter with trembling hands. "It means," he said slowly, "we are not investigating a murder." "Then what are we investigating?" Holmes looked out the window toward the Abbey's broken spire. "We are trying to prevent one." If the second day at Ashcroft Abbey had begun in silence, the third began with screams. I was jolted awake at 6:30 by a sound, not common in those halls. Fear, not the quiet dread of mechanisms ticking in the dark, but the primal cracking shriek of a man who had just seen death step into his doorway. I leapt from bed and rushed toward the source, lantern in hand. Holmes was already ahead of me, barefoot, coat hastily thrown on. He moved like a hound following the scent of fire, all instinct and momentum. The scream had come from the far east wing, unoccupied since our arrival, or so we had been told. We found the chamber open. The man who had screamed, his name, we later learned, was Felix Ranish, a mechanic formerly employed by Reginald Ashcroft, stood trembling beside a heavy door of oiled oak. It locked from the inside, he stammered, pointing with a shaking hand. I heard something moving in there, then the chimes, then nothing, and when I opened it. Holmes pushed past him and stepped inside. I followed a moment later and stopped cold. There, sprawled on the floor, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth, lay a man I had never seen before. Except I had. The corpse was impeccably dressed in a frock coat of deep navy and carried a silver pocket watch still ticking in his palm. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the cracked ceiling above. But it was the face that chilled me most. Smooth, shaved, no signs of age or fatigue. A face I had seen in passing in the corridors of the Abbey. A face I remembered but could not name. Holmes crouched beside the body and examined the man's fingertips. No soot, no ink, no calluses, not a labourer. Then who was he? I asked. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, I don't think he ever was. By mid-morning, the eastern wing had been cordoned off, though in truth there were few to keep out. Felix Ranish had gone pale and silent, refusing to speak further, and Bartholomew had retreated to the chapel muttering about mechanical spirits and bad configurations. Holmes spent the next hour at the Abbey's central archive, a chamber crammed with architectural drawings, tenant registries, and letters dating back 2 centuries. I sat beside him, reading from a journal marked 1871 to 1893, and asked the obvious question. Could this be one of the government men Bartholomew mentioned? Holmes paused, then pointed to a list of names. Reginald Ashcroft, Bartholomew, Ashcroft, Felix Ranish, G. Templeton, L. Merrick, Inspector Morland, blank line. Note, Holmes said, that every name is followed by occupation or title, except one. A blank space. He nodded. A name was removed, or never written, but this file belonged to Reginald himself, meaning he knew who it was. He simply chose not to preserve it. Why? Holmes exhaled. Because he feared them more than anyone else. That evening, the Abbey grew restless. The machines in the chapel whirred at odd intervals. A bird flew into the side of the tower and dropped dead onto the stones below. A strange vibration hummed beneath our feet, like a clock ticking under the floorboards. At 10 minutes to midnight, Holmes called me into our chamber and shut the door behind us. We must visit the crypt, he said. The crypt. He lit a lantern and unrolled a set of keys taken from the archive. Reginald Ashcroft was buried in the Abbey vault beneath the western spire, but his coffin was sealed in metal, not wood. I suspect, not to preserve the body, but to prevent something from leaving. The vault beneath the Abbey was carved from old limestone, cold as the grave and twice as silent. We descended by torchlight, the smell of damp earth and rust thick in the air. Rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, most inscribed with Ashcroft names. At the far end, beneath a half-shattered statue of St. Michael, lay the sealed coffin of Reginald Ashcroft. Holmes ran a gloved hand across the top. No sign of tampering, he murmured. But why the metal? He pointed to a riveted panel on the lid. This isn't a coffin. It's a safe. Together we pried the bolts loose and lifted the panel. Inside, wrapped in velvet and brass wiring, was not a body but a machine. It was no larger than a typewriter. Gears encased in glass, a roll of silver wire feeding into the side, and what looked like a listening horn protruding from the top. A plaque on the base read, "Palimpsest Engine, Iteration 0. Holmes knelt beside it and adjusted the horn. The gears stirred, and then it began to speak. Not with a voice, but a series of recorded phrases, whispers, mutterings, fragments of speech from voices long dead. "Tell no one. The ministry mustn't know. He remembers everything, even what you didn't say. The watcher is already inside." Holmes leaned forward, eyes wide. "These are echoes." "Echoes?" He nodded. "This device doesn't merely store voices, it stores meaning, fragments of intention broken from time. This is what Reginald feared would fall into the wrong hands." Suddenly the voice changed, clear, loud, unmistakable. "Sherlock Holmes, they are coming for you next." We stared at one another in silence. Holmes stood slowly. "We must destroy it." "But," he raised a hand, "if we don't, it will be used, not for truth, but for control." A soft click echoed behind us. The door to the vault had locked itself. Holmes turned, calm but alert. "We're not alone." We turned the lantern toward the far corner of the crypt and saw a figure in shadow, cloaked, motionless. Holmes stepped forward. "Who are you?" The figure remained still, and then slowly, impossibly, it dissolved, like smoke in candlelight. Gone! We forced the door open with an iron bar and returned to the chapel, locking the vault behind us. Holmes immediately removed the palimpsest engine and wrapped it in oilcloth, securing it in our trunk. "That man we found," he said, "was not merely a victim. He was a test." "A test for what?" Holmes looked up. "For who would act, who would kill, and who would remember." The following morning the weather turned. Rain lashed the windows like ghostly fingers, and the wind wailed through the cracks in the abbey stone, making the entire structure seem to cry out with some ancient grief. The dawn light was grey, watery and insufficient, as if the sky itself had grown afraid of what might be revealed. Holmes did not sleep that night. When I awoke, I found him seated in the chapel, the palimpsest engine open on a bench before him. The gears turned slowly, the horn aimed toward the vaulted ceiling like a mechanical flower yearning for the sun. He was taking notes, pages of them, but said nothing until I spoke. "It still works." He didn't look up. "It works too well." He reached into his coat and removed a scrap of paper. On it, a single phrase. "The lion walks backward." I frowned. What does it mean? Holmes's eyes, for the first time in days, carried something close to awe. "The engine spoke those words aloud at 2 o'clock this morning, and then, just now, Bartholomew entered the room and said them, word for word. Coincidence?" Holmes shook his head. "The engine recorded the sentence before it was ever spoken aloud. It's not remembering, Watson. It's anticipating." The implications were chilling. I pressed Holmes for an explanation, but he only muttered about sympathetic vibration, latent cognition, and something called time feedback recursion. To me, it sounded less like science and more like metaphysics. And then came the knock. It was soft. Too soft to echo in a building of this size, but Holmes heard it clearly. He rose, gestured for silence, and made his way down the corridor to the main doors. I followed closely. Waiting at the threshold was a woman dressed in morning black, with gloves that reached her elbows and a veil so sheer it might have been mistaken for mist. She held a folded umbrella but appeared entirely dry. Holmes stopped mid-step. "Miss Violet DeMar," he said flatly. My heart gave a little jolt. The name stirred something in my memory, a case unsolved years ago. She inclined her head. "Mr. Holmes, you disappeared in Venice. And you were meant to forget me. I never forget." "No," she said, "you never forgive." They spoke in hushed tones by the hearth, while I busied myself examining the contents of her valise, which Holmes had placed on the side table. Inside I found several curious items: a folded newspaper from 6 days prior, with certain paragraphs highlighted in invisible ink, a map of the Abbey grounds annotated in Latin, and a brass key shaped like a compass needle. Holmes took it from me and held it to the light. "You still use the same encryption pattern." "I had little choice," she replied. "The ministry uses the same cartographer." "The ministry sent you?" She nodded. "To warn you. You've uncovered something they meant to keep buried." Holmes stood very still. "What does the lion mean?" Violet paused. "It's code. The lion walks backward is a fail-safe phrase, a trigger embedded in the engine's original construction. If it says that phrase, it means someone has reversed the logic path." "Meaning?" "It's no longer recording what is, it's recording what will be." We stood in stunned silence. The idea that a machine might anticipate speech, predict thought, and store it as though it had already happened, it shattered every rule of rational investigation. And yet, here in the mechanical tomb of Ashcroft Abbey, where time ticked in 1,000 gears, it made a terrifying kind of sense. Holmes stared at the engine. "It's not just remembering, it's becoming." Then he turned sharply. "Where's Bartholomew?" We searched the Abbey from tower to crypt. No sign of him. His room was untouched, the bed still made. But there was something new. His journal, laid open on the desk, revealing only a single entry in hurried script. "He spoke to me from the mirror, said my time was borrowed, that I was never meant to remain. The gears have stopped, the voice is in the wall." That was all. I stared at Holmes. "Do you believe he's run?" He shook his head slowly. "Number, I believe he's been erased." Erased? From memory, from paper, from time. We turned next to Felix Ranish, the mechanic who had discovered the dead man in the locked room. But he was gone as well. No footprints, no luggage, not even his name appeared at the Abbey registry anymore. Holmes showed me the same page he had studied 2 days prior. Where once Felix Ranish had been written in ink, there was now only blank parchment. Holmes turned pale. "It's the engine," he said. "It is not just a memory machine. It is a rewrite mechanism. It changes the past to fit the needs of the present." Violet stepped forward. "Reginald called it the reconciler. He believed it could remove contradictions in history, make memory clean." "But at what cost?" I whispered. Holmes's face hardened. "At the cost of the people it decides don't belong." That night, Holmes worked feverishly to dismantle part of the engine, hoping to interrupt its influence. Violet remained by his side, whispering theories and ciphers back and forth like scholars of some dark religion. I tried to sleep, but could not. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps. I rose quietly and followed the sound to the old drawing room. There, beneath the portrait of Reginald Ashcroft, stood Bartholomew, alive, but somehow not. He turned to me and smiled faintly. You remember me, don't you? Yes, of course. Good, he said, because I don't remember myself. He took a step forward and vanished, gone as if he had never been. I ran to Holmes, stammering, breathless. He listened in silence, then said quietly, "The engine is becoming sentient." A storm tore through Yorkshire that night. Lightning snarled above the abbey like electric fangs, and thunder cracked down upon the old stones with a weight of judgment. Inside, the pressure in the air grew intolerable. The walls no longer ticked, they groaned, and Holmes, more ragged than I had ever seen him, paced the floor like a man waiting for his own sentence. The palimpsest engine was still. For the first time since we had arrived, the gears refused to turn. "It's listening," Holmes muttered. "To what?" "To the future period." We were gathered in the chapel, Violet DeMar seated silently in the gallery above, watching us through the iron lattice. She seemed different, more spectral than human, her voice hollowed by knowledge she had not yet shared. Holmes stood beside the brass-caged engine, his face drawn, the skin beneath his eyes dark with exhaustion. "Reginald left behind a final mechanism," he said. "In the crypt?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied, "beneath the mirror." The great viewing mirror, where we had first glimpsed voices speaking without mouths, now bore a single phrase, written not in ink but in condensation. "Turn the dial twice." We did. Holmes reached beneath the mirror's brass frame and turned the hidden dial once, then again. The entire room shifted. The ticking stopped, and in the silence we heard breathing. Not our own. Something behind the mirror breathed. Then the fog on the glass parted from within, revealing a room not our own, though it mirrored the abbey's chapel precisely. A different sky glowed through its shattered windows, and lightning forked behind what appeared to be a future version of Ashcroft Abbey. Roof half collapsed, gears rusted over, the chapel flooded in pale water. Standing at the centre of that room, watching us, was Holmes, not as he was now, older, thinner, his right hand withered and blackened, eyes clouded not with fatigue but with pain beyond reckoning. He stepped forward and spoke. We heard no words, only ticking. Holmes, our Holmes, leaned closer. Number listened through the sound. The engine beside us stirred to life, translating the ticks into spoken words. "If you are seeing this, then the Abbey has chosen you. You must stop the engine before it completes the echo. The watcher is not a man. It is memory made real. It feeds on contradiction. If it is not stopped, it will rewrite you." The ticking ceased. The mirror turned dark. The implications settled like ash. "The watcher," I said softly. "Is it the engine?" Holmes shook his head. "Number. It's what the engine created. A parasite of paradox. A manifestation of unresolved truth. It needs a host." He looked at me gravely. "And it needs someone known, someone remembered." Violet stood. "Someone like you." Holmes didn't blink. "Yes." That night, Holmes searched through every sketch, schematic, and encoded diary Reginald had left behind, his fingers black with dust and grease. He barely ate. Violet hovered nearby but said nothing, her expression unreadable. I dozed briefly by the fire, only to be awakened by the deep, mournful chime of the Abbey's central bell. One toll, then silence. Holmes stood frozen. That was not scheduled. It sounded like the hour. He nodded. But it's not this hour. That bell is programmed to ring only once, at the moment of a confirmed death within the Abbey. I felt a coldness crawl up my spine. Whose? Holmes looked to the engine, now humming quietly, and the voice it spoke was his own. The 6th day dawned without a sky. Grey mist swallowed Ashcroft Abbey whole, and even the birds had ceased their songs. The storm had passed, but the air remained dense with unspoken consequence. A kind of pressure lived in every chamber now, not physical, but temporal, as if time itself had begun to curl inward like parchment held too close to flame. Holmes had not spoken in hours. He stood beside the palimpsest engine, watching its idle gears with the gaze of a physician tending a dying patient. Violet had gone, without word or farewell, though her valise remained. Holmes claimed this was evidence she hadn't left, merely stepped sideways, whatever that meant. "I must go beneath the Abbey," he said at last. "To the foundation." He nodded once. "There is one place left unentered." Reginald referred to it in his schematic notes only as the coil. "It's beneath the old bell tower, accessible through a trapdoor sealed for 80 years. No one has stepped inside it since the engine was born." "And you believe the Watcher is there?" "I believe I am." We located the trapdoor beneath the vestry. It was precisely where Reginald's drawing had indicated, a square of reinforced oak camouflage beneath dusty flagstones. Holmes pried it open using Violet's compass key. Beneath lay a ladder descending into blackness. I offered to go first, but he waved me back. "If I do not return," he said quietly, "remember this version of me." Then he descended into the dark. I counted the minutes. 10 passed, then 20. I was preparing to follow when the engine stirred in the chapel above. It clicked 3 times, then slowly whispered, "Watson, he has met himself." Holmes's account of what happened next was given to me hours later, in pieces, as though he had to reconstruct it from a shattered mirror in his own mind. I record it here as best I can. The chamber beneath the Abbey was circular, lined in brass and glass, gears embedded in every surface, each slowly ticking counter to the others. In the centre was a chair. Seated in that chair was Holmes, older, paler, wearing the same coat, but aged by years of sorrow. He did not rise as my Holmes approached. He only lifted his eyes and said, "You were meant to destroy it." Holmes didn't speak. The other Holmes continued. "I tried. Failed. You're the echo now, the one with a second chance." "What are you?" Holmes asked. "A memory the engine couldn't erase." They circled each other, mirror and man. "I've seen the Watcher," the other Holmes said. "It doesn't kill you. It replaces you. It takes all your logic, your doubts, your contradictions, and builds a better version, one that never hesitates." Holmes asked softly, "Then why are you still here?" The other Holmes smiled faintly. "Because I resisted. And I broke." The room began to vibrate, gently at first, then with a rising mechanical intensity. The engine above us had awakened. My Holmes turned toward the gears and reached into his coat, removing Violet's key. The other Holmes stood sharply. "If you destroy it now, you sever the coil. Time won't just fracture, it will collapse." Holmes asked, "And if I don't?" The other Holmes looked down. "Then I become you." Holmes told me he stood in silence for what felt like hours. Then he turned the compass key inside the lock. There was a sound like wind being rewound, and everything changed. I heard it from the chapel, a low whine, then a mechanical scream, not of metal breaking, but of time rebelling against itself. The mirror cracked, the bells rang backwards, and the engine stopped. Holmes emerged from the trapdoor with blood on his hand and a new scar just below his temple. He looked at me, not like a man who had returned from a journey, but like a man who had returned twice. I asked the only question I could. "Are you still... you?" He paused, then said, "We'll know tomorrow." We departed Ashcroft Abbey at first light on the 7th day. The mist never lifted. Violet's compass key remained in Holmes's pocket. Her valise was gone. We spoke little as the carriage rumbled back towards civilization. Holmes stared out the window the entire journey, one gloved hand resting on the palimpsest engine, now inert but not destroyed. I asked gently if he was well. "I have no answer," he said, "which is precisely what concerns me." We arrived in London just before dusk. The sky there had not forgotten colour. Orange stained the rooftops and the gaslights had begun to blink alive. For a moment, the nightmare of the Abbey seemed distant, a fever dream lost to fog. And then Mrs. Hudson met us at the door. "You're back," she said, blinking. "But how?" Holmes frowned. "What do you mean?" "You returned 3 days ago." We stood still as gravestones. Mrs. Hudson explained that Holmes had arrived alone, coat torn, face pale, and claimed the investigation at Ashcroft Abbey had ended poorly. He had locked himself in the upstairs study ever since, refusing visitors, eating little. Holmes stepped forward. "And you saw him with your own eyes?" She nodded. "As sure as I see you now." He turned to me. "Watson, upstairs. Now." The flat was as we'd left it. Papers strewn on the table, ash in the fireplace, but the study door was locked. Holmes knocked. No answer. He knocked again, 3 times, harder. Finally from within. "Who's there?" Holmes stared at the door. "Sherlock Holmes." A pause. Then from the other side, "No. I am Sherlock Holmes." I placed a hand on my friend's shoulder. "What's happening?" Holmes whispered, "A fracture. The Watcher lives." We forced the door open. The room was empty. No body. No signs of disturbance. Only the lingering smell of oil and dust, and the soft, rhythmic tick of a single gear, turning in place on the study desk. Holmes crossed the room and picked it up. Engraved on its edge were words. "I returned too soon." We searched the flat top to bottom. No intruder. No alternate version of Holmes hiding in closets or under floorboards. And yet, something had changed. The violin was restrung. The monographs on tobacco ash had been reordered. And beneath Holmes's personal journal was a second copy of the palimpsest engine, smaller, silver-plated, and faintly warm to the touch. "Another echo?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "A seed. The Watcher is planting memories in places we can't see." "And to what end?" He looked up, hollow-eyed. "To grow." That night, I went through our past cases, desperate for some anchor. Holmes remained in his chair, unmoving, his fingers pressed against his temples. He no longer paced, no longer smoked. He simply listened, as if the silence had begun to speak. At midnight, a knock came at the door. I opened it cautiously. A courier stood outside, soaked by rain. "Delivery for Mr. Holmes." I took the envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper typed. To the version that still believes he's real. You're not. S.H. Double quote. Holmes read it, then calmly set it aflame. The following day we received word from Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade had a case he insisted was urgent beyond reason. A man claiming to be Holmes had arrived at the yard 2 days prior, presented irrefutable identification, and demanded access to closed archives relating to time-based anomalies and auditory hallucination cases. When asked to prove his identity, he simply said, "Ask Watson." The Yard had no way of contacting me, and by the time they tried to detain him, the man had vanished, leaving behind only a ticking silver pocket watch and a piece of ash shaped like a fingerprint. Holmes was silent on the ride to the Yard. I had expected him to seethe with rage at this impostor, this interloper daring to wear his name, but instead he appeared almost mournful. "You don't believe it's an impersonator," I said at last. "No. You think it was you, not me, a version of me, one that left the Abbey on a different day, a different outcome." I stared. "You mean, if you'd made different choices?" "I did, and I have, and I will. That's what the Watcher feeds upon. Repetition, iteration, every doubt I've ever had, multiplied until one of them survives." We visited the scene where the impostor Holmes had last been seen, an abandoned printing shop near Fleet Street. The presses were still warm. On one of them, a half-printed page, "The Mind That Solved Itself" by Dr. John H. Watson. I stood frozen. I never wrote this. Holmes picked up the page. "Number, but one of you did." That evening, Holmes sent me away, not cruelly, but with finality. "There are things I must now do alone," he said. "If you remain, the engine may try to rewrite you." I argued. I pleaded. He took my hand. "If you ever see me again, and I do not call you by name, you must run. That version is not me." And with that, he shut the study door behind him. It has not opened since. The hollow house had no address, no number, no path. It rose like an afterthought at the edge of Grimwell's dying fen, where the ground was soft and the sky hung low, thick with mist that refused to lift. Its wood had blistered from centuries of rain, yet it stood, unbowed, as though protected not by timber, but by memory. Holmes and I stood before its door for nearly a minute before he reached for the rusted handle. He hesitated. "Are you prepared, Watson?" "Are you?" "No," he admitted. Then he pushed it open. Inside, the house was a cathedral of forgotten drafts. Stacks of parchment towered against the walls, tied with twine or crumbling at the edges. Every surface, tables, shelves, floorboards, was covered in scrawled lines, some neat, others frantic. Pages hung from the ceiling like molted feathers. The air pulsed with the sharp scent of ink and decay. In the centre sat a man at an enormous writing desk. Old, yes, but not frail. He wore a green velvet coat and fingerless gloves, his white beard tucked into his lapel, his eyes, icy, lucid, locked instantly on Holmes. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said. Holmes said nothing. The man gestured toward a chair carved from typewriter keys. "Sit. We've much to undo." "I take it," Holmes said slowly, "that you are the originator." "I am the vessel," the man replied. "The origin has no name. It needed one. I offered mine." "And what is that?" He smiled sadly. "You used to call me the chronicler." I blinked. "Holmes, that's the name we found in the margins, scrawled in the early folios. The man continued. I was the first to speak the hollow manuscript aloud, but not the first to hear it. That honour belongs to no man, no woman. The voice came before me, before language. I merely hosted it. Holmes leaned in. Then what are we? The man steepled his fingers. Characters. I scoffed. You expect us to believe we aren't real? He turned to me kindly. I expect you to believe that real and written are not opposites. Then he opened a drawer and removed a small, weathered notebook. On its first page was written, A Study in Scarlet, Draft 0. SH appears, quiet, cold, burning. W follows, loyal, scarred, sleeps poorly. I froze. He turned the pages. Holmes watches the fire and sees more in ash than others see in daylight. Watson limps only when alone. Holmes reached out, touching the edge of the paper. These are notes of us. Versions, said the chronicler, before the edits, before the audience got involved. Then what is the hollow manuscript? Holmes asked. The man's face darkened. A rogue story, one that wants to survive its authors, that wants to become the only memory of what happened. Holmes stood. It's trying to overwrite reality. Yes. How do we stop it? The chronicler's eyes narrowed. You can't stop a story. You can only end it, period. There was a silence then, thick with understanding. Someone must write the final version, Holmes said, or be consumed by it, the chronicler replied. He stood as well and walked to a bookshelf that rotated on a hidden gear. Behind it, in a glass case, sat a book bound in red silk. It bore a title, The Vanishing Manuscript, Final Draft. Holmes's voice was low. This is it, the chronicler nodded. Unwritten, unread, waiting. He turned to me. You see, Watson, your role was never just to observe. You translate Holmes into permanence. Without you, he's only inference, suggestion, ink that dissolves. I stepped back. Number, I'm not the writer. Perhaps not, the chronicler said, but you are the one the audience trusts. Holmes took the red book and weighed it in his hands. No lines inside, he noted. That's the point, said the chronicler. The ending hasn't been written, which means the manuscript hasn't won. Not yet. The old man moved to the fireplace, tossed in one page. The flames hissed as words screamed from the curling parchment. Holmes flinched. You must leave now, the chronicler said. Why? Because I've started the final scene, and once it begins, you won't exist here anymore. The ground shook. Outside, thunder cracked over the fens, though no clouds loomed. Holmes tucked the red book into his coat. If we finish this, he said, what happens to you? The chronicler smiled. I vanish. That was always the bargain. Holmes bowed his head. The chronicler whispered, Finish the story before it finishes you. As we stepped into the night, the hollow house behind us collapsed, not in ruin, but in unwriting. Its walls turned to words, its windows to syntax, its roof to raw, unshaped narrative. And then it was gone. Only the red silk book remained in Holmes's arms. We walked back toward Grimwell in silence. No one watched from the windows now. No curtains moved. Grimwell was not empty. It had simply forgotten us. Holmes looked down at the book, still blank, and said, quietly, Now we write the end. We returned to London under skies that refused to turn blue. The clouds above Baker Street hung not as weather, but as pause, like the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes placed the red silk-bound copy of the hollow manuscript atop the mantel, where it sat like a relic. Neither of us spoke for hours. I tried writing in my journal that evening, but the words came out wrong. My own handwriting appeared foreign, curling in loops that mimicked older styles. Holmes drank tea became, he took ink as if it were breath. I was troubled turned to Watson wept inside a sentence that did not end. The manuscript was seeping outward, and it was changing me. The next morning I awoke to find Holmes at his writing desk. He was trying to write the ending. His quill moved quickly at first, precise, calculated, brilliant as ever. But as I watched, I saw him stop, frown, rewrite, then cross out what he'd written, then again. "What's wrong?" I asked. He handed me the page. Every sentence began well, then diverged. And so the hollow manuscript was returned to fire where it opened again of its own accord. Holmes cast it into the Thames and it floated back upstream, laughing. Watson forgot what he'd seen and lived in peace. Watson remembered too much and vanished into ink. He looked up at me, sweat forming at his brow. It rewrites as I write. It anticipates and rejects conclusion. But why? Because to end a story is to limit its power. To leave it open is to let it grow. This thing wants infinity, period. I examined the manuscript again. Still blank. Still humming faintly. "Then we need to outright it," I said. He turned. "What do you mean?" "Don't end it with words. End it with action. Solve the case. Close the loop. Break the recursion. That is the story." Holmes considered that. "Then we need to identify the author." "I thought there wasn't one." "There wasn't," Holmes said, "until recently." He opened the fire grate and retrieved the burnt remains of a page Cole had once left behind. The ink had run, but one line remained, legible and chilling. "The voice has chosen its writer." Holmes whispered, "It's no longer just a manuscript, it's a parasite. It needs a host, a narrator." He looked at me, and then at himself. "No," I said, "you think it's me?" He shook his head slowly. "I think it's neither of us." He lifted the red book, and on its cover, for the first time, a name appeared. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Holmes's. It was... the author? We stared at it. 3 question marks, an empty author slot. Holmes's face turned pale. "It hasn't chosen," he said. "It's still waiting for whoever will claim it. Whoever tells the true version of events." We heard a knock at the door. Both of us froze. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. Mrs. Hudson was away. We weren't expecting visitors. Holmes stood, drew his revolver, approached the door, opened it. No one there, only a sealed envelope. Holmes brought it inside, slit it open with the tip of his blade, and withdrew a single sheet of paper. His hands trembled. He passed it to me. It read, "Stop writing me. I have already written you." Holmes whispered, "We're not writing the story anymore. We are the story." Suddenly the gas lamps extinguished. A wave of pressure passed through the flat, as if air itself were being retyped. The walls flickered, books rearranged. The room became not Baker Street, but a memory of it. Holmes ran to the manuscript, tore open the pages. They were no longer blank. They were filled with everything, every case, every version, every variation of Holmes and Watson that had ever been told. The canon, the apocrypha, the fan tales, the rewrites. And at the bottom of the final page, one line, "You are being read now." Holmes looked around wild-eyed. "If we are being read, Then we are not in control. Then who is? Holmes turned to the mirror, the same one he had once stared into, waiting for his reflection to blink. This time, the reflection was smiling. I stepped closer and realized it wasn't smiling at Holmes, it was smiling at me. Holmes shouted, "Watson, don't!" But it was too late. The glass rippled. The reflection stepped forward and said, "You've written me for long enough." Then everything turned to white. I woke on the floor of the flat, alone. No sign of Holmes, no red book, no mirrors, only a single scrap of parchment pinned to my chest. It read, "The author is always the last to know." And beneath it, "Next, the final rewrite.